Hi and welcome to Leaders of Africa Live. My name is Peter Pinar and I'm your host. Leaders of Africa Live is a show and experience featuring diverse perspectives on some of the most important problems of our day. We invite you to discuss and interact with us. Hit the subscribe button on YouTube and click the notification bell to hear about all of Leaders of Africa's new content when it is released. We welcome you to do that now. For those of you who are new to Leaders of Africa mobilizes the power of research and creative expression to advance equity, justice, and selfless leadership with a distinctly Pan-African, community-oriented, and interactive approach. Today we are joined by three wonderful guests to discuss tech in higher education in the COVID-19 era and beyond. Professor Dick Njambi is a full professor in educational technology at the University of Cape Town. He is the founder and project director of the Educational Technology Inquiry Lab, ETILab. Many of you already know him as one of the leading researchers in emerging technologies and changing practices in developing contexts. We are so happy to have you on the program. We are also joined by two returning panelists on our higher education series here at Leaders of Africa. Professor Caro Meyers is an associate professor at the University of Eswatini. She coordinates the Linguistics and Modern Languages Unit in the Institute of Distance Education. She has published widely in a variety of research fields, ranging from teaching and learning of languages in particular, to distance and e-learning, and literature across many different genres. Finally, we are joined by Dr. Apona Sig. She is a senior lecturer and academic leader of the discipline of Information Systems and Technology at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. Her research interests include educational technology and its ability to mobilize student learning. Welcome to all of you. It's good to see Karen and Apasana again, and it's great to see you, and welcome, Dick. Good to see all of you.
Thank you for having us.
All right, so let's begin with on a little bit of a lighter note here, just to get to know each other so that we can begin our conversation. And my first question to all of you is, we all have that favorite class that we teach, right? Or set of classes or themes that we teach. We all know it. We all teach a lot of different subjects, but there are those favorite classes that we teach. So I'm curious, as we get into this conversation about pedagogy, what is your favorite class to teach? And I want to start with you, Apasana. What would you say is your favorite course to teach?
Thanks, Peter, for that introduction. Greetings to the other panel members. My favorite course to teach would be a third-year level module, which I teach in IT, and that's to do with IT consulting. It helps to get the students some perspective as to what they would see in the real world when they get out there. So besides just taking on an ordinary job where they become an employee of an organization, we try to teach them how they can become their own consultants. And in this module, we have a lot of interaction with IT consulting companies. We have a lot of interaction with ex-students of ours who have become consultants. So to me, this becomes the application of what we teach them throughout their 3-year degree.
Wonderful. Good. So application is important. We're not just focusing on theoretical constructs, although those are quite important to our inquiry, but the practical and the applied element is quite exciting. How about yourself, Karen? What is your sort of favorite course to teach?
Well, I mean, I come from a language teaching background. And so for me, anytime I can work around language, I get very motivated and excited, because for me, language is something that opens doors. And to be able to continue doing that using technology these days is even more motivating. So anything that has to do with language teaching and learning, I'm happy.
Mm-hmm. Are there any particular language courses that have been quite intriguing over the years that you've put together? I'm curious to know.
Well, I think a lot has changed over the years, where we were much more theory-based and maybe much more from different angles. Today, we're trying to be more learner-centered. We're trying to really encourage and motivate students to use the language there and then. So I think it remains a bit vague, but I think that's, the larger type of changes that I've seen and that I really love.
Wonderful, wonderful. And last to you, Dick, what is your sort of favorite course or courses to teach?
Well, thank you for that question, really. I mean, my favorite course to teach is digital sandpits, and I should be able to just mention what they are, because one of the things that I really find fascinating to facilitate is the whole aspect of getting students to engage in creative designs, in creative works. And in particular, when one speaks about digital sandpits, it's all about allowing and facilitating the whole concept of play and having fun while discovering the uses of technologies. So I find digital sandpits really fascinating to facilitate, and that's what I would really consider to be my favorite course to teach, digital sandpits.
Wonderful. Very, very, very cool. And we're going to talk about some of these technological tools as well as conversations about the gamification and the applying of sort of games to learning as we get in our conversation. But I do have one other last question as we get to know each other, which is, what is your most memorable moment? It could be a positive moment. It could be a challenging moment when it comes to digital teaching. So what was your sort of most memorable moment? And Dick, we'll start with you. What is your most memorable sort of digital teaching experience or moment?
I would consider my most memorable moment was when I was creating podcasts for my courses. And what happened then was that I was recording every discussion, every presentation, every student discussion in the class. So the idea was to actually create podcasts from these different audio conversations. And I did not realize at the time that the use of podcasts were actually mediating some of my students whose English was not their first language. And then there was this particular student who reflected on the whole concept of podcasts and defined podcasts in his own way based on his experience of using podcasts. And I actually found that as a very memorable moment when I had an experience of a student defining a concept based on his lived experience of it, as opposed to defining a concept based on what other people have actually defined it. And I actually found that was very memorable. To date, I mean, I still reflect on that, to actually see the kind of impact that podcast had, not just on all the students, which of course most of the students who engaged with it impacted them. But this particular student, his lived experience was very impactful, and I consider that as a very memorable moment for me.
Wonderful, wonderful. And we're going to be talking about sort of different assignments, different platforms that we can use. We do see, and I should say for myself as well, I've experimented with doing class podcasts as well, both as an individual level as well as group projects. And I think I can sympathize with some of the observations that you had of sort of bringing unique perspectives and also giving students a comfortability with using their voice, for instance, in the context of a broader theme that they're looking at. So I really love that. How about yourself, Apona? What was one sort of memorable digital teaching moment?
My memorable teaching moments, I think, was during the COVID pandemic, because I have been using technology previously and I didn't realize that we could use technology in such an engaging fashion with our students. So experimenting with the free software, software like Slido and those kind of Mentimeter and so on, helped me to see how well we could engage with students in an online environment. Because, typically we thought that online lecturing isn't that exciting. It's very hard, very difficult to get student engagement. And when you see the number of free tools that there are available and the different types of engagement levels that can happen, it's very, very, very exciting. So for me, that was my best moment with the use of technology.
Wonderful, wonderful. And lastly, to you, Karen, what's your most memorable experience?
Well, mine, Peter, is also a very recent one. I'm going to talk about two memorable experiences. The first one is a very positive one. I had given the students, and we're in the COVID pandemic, so the students are away. I'd given them an assignment to collaboratively create a PowerPoint presentation and then use voiceover. So I'd kept it simple. But one of the groups took it a little bit further, and they really designed a nice video where they were all participating. And so they had worked with each other at a distance, but they had been able to combine all that. So I thought that was really, really impressive. And then the not so memorable, well, the memorable but a little bit more negative one was with a group of students where we had scheduled a Zoom meeting, and I was talking and I was introducing concepts, and only to find out after about 15 minutes that nobody had heard me. That finally in the chat, they had understood that in the chat they could say that there was an audio issue. So that was the not so nice one.
Well, I'm hoping now that our audience is hopefully hearing us as well. If you don't, please let us know, because that's a common problem that one faces, is that we're waiting for that feedback as well. And we also, as we get into our conversation here, talking about these technological tools, we will invite you as the audience to also chime in the chat. We are monitoring the chat. All of us are here and monitoring the chat. So please feel free to put your comments and questions there. We'll be raising those throughout the conversation. And I want to start off with talking about mobile technologies that have been used. And one of the key things that we see in terms of the conversation about this current pandemic and digital teaching is this digital divide that is present, right? And the problem that students don't have access to either, many students don't have as well as access to sort of internet connectivity that will connect them if we are engaging in conversations or education on online platforms, or they're missing the device or capabilities on the device to use those. And so a lot of the conversation during this pandemic period has been about the use of mobile phones and mobile technologies, apps, WhatsApp, as well as other educational apps. And so I'm curious to you, Dick, thinking about this issue of mobile technologies, what are some of the things that we see being experimented with in terms of using phones to reach students as a way of perhaps bridging this digital divide? Let's start there.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a useful point to start with. First and foremost, I think it would be useful to understand the difference between when technology is in the hands of the teacher and how the teacher ends up teaching, and which one would be able to call digital teaching, and what happens when the technology is in the hands of the student, which is digital learning, effectively. Now, what happens during the pandemic, for example, when students had to move from face-to-face to being in isolation, was that technology could not be just in the hands of the teacher, because if the technology is in the hands of the teacher, you are not going to reach the students. Now, so technology must be in the hands of both the teacher and in the hands of the learner. Now, once we accept that, because the whole understanding of the digital divide and how that the pandemic seemed to have amplified an understanding of this digital divide in terms of people with access and those without access. I should also be able to add that even some of the people with access, they had some epistemological barriers where they had access, but they didn't know what to do with that access. In this case, where teachers who had never taught with the technology, they had access to the technology, but because they had never taught with the technology, they did not know what to do with the technology. And most of the places, for example, in South Africa, most schools ban the use of mobile phones or even bringing the mobile phones to school. And because of that, those kind of policies simply meant that the teachers did not have an opportunity to learn with the learners and mediating their use of the mobile phones in the classroom, because as it were, schools had demonized the use of the mobile phones. And during the pandemic, we now had a situation whereby the teachers who did not want, or the schools which did not want the mobile phones in the hands of the learners, now had to begin asking the learners whether they had the mobile phones so that they can be able to use those devices for teaching. Now, it's quite odd to expect that when learners are now in isolation, that is then became a point where teachers needed to help learners learn with the device which they did not necessarily want in the face-to-face. Now, that is one of the challenges there, because it became very clear that for the schools and teachers which welcomed the use of mobile devices in school, where they had used the bring your own device to school, schools that supported bring your own device, and therefore used the devices which learners brought with at school, survived well during the pandemic, because it was much easier to just move to transition from face-to-face, bring your own device, to now dispersed, distributed, and mediating the kind of learning with the kind of devices that students had. That is one part of it. The other is the whole idea of what exactly does one do with the mobile phone when the mobile phone is in the hands of the student. What is the purpose of that? If we understand what you do with that, then it becomes easier for one to understand how best you can be able to design learning activities that would make the most of the devices that are in the hands of the students. Now, one use of the mobile device has been in reducing the transactional distance. By this, is put simply, transaction distance in this case is reducing the distance between when a student has a question or a challenge and when they can successfully access help. Now, the mobile device became easier to actually facilitate that. In most places where schools or teachers or academic staff used the learning management systems or mobile phones as a medium of dissemination of information, or be it PowerPoints and things like that, it was more about using the device to push content to the students as opposed to pulling the students' engagement and facilitating engagement and interactions. In situations like that, it was almost difficult to get the most from the devices that were in the hands of the students. I'm going to pause there and then so that we'll be able to come back to this later.
Yeah, I think that is a really powerful point of the importance of thinking about devices and how we're using them as a potentially a two-way street, right? Both in terms of providing or giving information, right? Posting information in some form, and then receiving information or getting some sort of feedback from the students. And I know, Karen, you've used quite a lot sort of mobile technologies, mobile apps to help facilitate that process of not only just sort of sharing announcements, sharing pointers, sharing tutorials, but also getting feedback from the students. So why don't you share a little bit about what has sort of worked in that respect, or what some of the challenges still remain, particularly when we're relying so heavily on mobile phones?
I think. Well, I'm talking to you about, of course, higher education. I mean, we've seen what's going on in primary and secondary schools, and I think we really need to reflect on that. But my experience is with higher education and with getting teachers ready to go back to primary and secondary schools and use the technologies that they've started to learn how to use themselves, and then transferring those skills to their own audiences. What works well, in my opinion and in my experience, is WhatsApp. And I think mostly because we were already used to using WhatsApp for our professional and personal lives daily. I think that was where we could see the transfer happening in the most smooth way. So what are we using WhatsApp for? As you said, I mean, often it's just for just for, giving people meeting times, making sure everybody's available, checking up on how people are doing, which is very important in a stressful situation like COVID-19. But we need to go beyond. And when we're thinking of language learning, asking people to show a class, a group on WhatsApp, a picture or a video, and asking them to comment that in the language they are learning is a very useful way to benefit from those mobile technologies. Let's say it like that. So we can use text, we can use audio, we can use video. We can use the emojis. I mean, emojis are part and parcel of, how we express ourselves. So I think this is a way that, students and especially also young learners should be able to express their emotions. And then we can help them go beyond that. It's very nice to put a smiley emoji, but what does it really mean? What are you trying to convey? And by having them talk about those emojis, they are using the language they are learning, and we are continuing that learning in any way, in any mode, in any environment that we can be. Mm-hmm. So I think that's what I would like to contribute here.
And I think you've added a new layer to this, and I think it's in line with what we were sharing at the beginning of our sort of memorable experiences, is that technology, particularly mobile technology, with its ability to pull images, to pull a sound, for example, to pull video in a very easy way, in a way that's familiar with students, that we have this new set of mediums that we're now making students become comfortable with, which is important for, in particular, dealing with issues of sort of expression and oral expression, for example, which, as you know, Karen, is important in language learning. And you've emphasized that quite a lot in your work. I'm curious from your perspective, Apona. So you also have talked about sort of the importance of using mobile phones in the context of teaching, WhatsApp and other sort of platforms. Are there other sort of applications or other usage of the mobile phones that perhaps we're underusing now, right? So we have talked about those common platforms that we're comfortable with, say WhatsApp, but are there other sort of avenues of using the mobile phone as a device of both sharing information and receiving information that we can think about?
Thanks, Peter. Yes, I think the mobile phone can be used for sharing and receiving information, but one thing we have noted in most of our courses and interactions with academics who are using the mobile phone is that it isn't conducive enough for learning purposes. So one of the major limitations students face when they use the mobile phone is the size of the screen. And if you're expecting them, for example, to submit an assignment using the Moodle application, because there is an app for Moodle which is available, and you need them to complete that assignment online, students have difficulty because the screen isn't big enough for them to see everything that they're typing out. One of the advantages with students connecting, for example, say to an online lecture using the mobile phone, is that if they use the Zoom app on the mobile phone, then the amount of data that they use is less than if they connect via their laptop. So there's advantages and disadvantages to using the mobile phone, but I think that the mobile phone can be used for engagement purposes, but if we want constructive learning to happen, then we need to look at students having access to bigger devices because they obviously need bigger screens in order to have their content either sent across or to receive large amounts of content from us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And we have a question in the chat about for you, Karen. I want to deal with this because I think this relates to a broader point. This comes from Jared, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. But is mentioning sort of this issue of assessment, right? And some of these creative assignments that we may be using, digital assignments, but particularly assignments that involve mobile phone tests. How do we assess that? How do we sort of measure or communicate student performance, or at least how have you thought about doing that?
Yeah, I think that there is a slight danger of overemphasizing the use of the digital technology, so that when it looks nice and it feels nice, we are attracted to it, and so we might be evaluating it more positively than what we would in another situation when we wouldn't have all those niceties of the mobile or the other technologies. So, I mean, for me, the main purpose of using the technology is to effectively communicate. So my assessment rubric would always concentrate on those issues. Of course, it's nice if the technology, helps to communicate better, but it shouldn't be the main focus. That is in my subjects. I think, Dick probably has a different opinion because his focus lies elsewhere, but maybe he can, take it a bit further there.
Right. Yeah, thank you. I mean, yeah, sure. I mean, my focus lies slightly differently there. But look, my view is that just like any technology, we need to be able to ensure we understand its affordances and use that appropriately. We know that the use of the mobile phone facilitates easy engagement in smaller chunks. That's what mobile learning makes it possible. Smaller chunks of content, smaller chunks of time, smaller chunks of communication, smaller chunks. So you want to be able to ensure that the use is actually broken down in those kind of ways. The other is communication is really two ways. Communication is not just about pushing information from point A to point B. You communicate when you can receive feedback from point B about the communication. So there must be some kind of engagement. What mobile phones enables us to do is to facilitate these kind of student-to-student interactions and use that to generate more content based on those kind of levels of interaction. And that is what we find from using WhatsApp as an example. WhatsApp does facilitate the interactions of student to student because the students are able to engage at that kind of level using multimodal aspects, text, video, and images, and so on. But also that the WhatsApp enables the communication of students to teacher. So that interaction also makes it possible. Then WhatsApp allows content to be put forward by the teacher, designing activities and designing tasks. If there is no task design, if the design of the task has not been appropriately done, the use of the mobile device is not going to be successful. It's not going to work. And that's one of the things that we've actually seen where arguments have been, place the device in the hands of the student and give them Wi-Fi or give them data. And then with all that, if you don't design a learning activity that exploits that, that uses that, learning is not going to happen because you've given them the device and you've given them data or you've given them Wi-Fi and things like that. So there is something more that needs to happen in terms of task designs. And I think that is one of the things that is critical here. The other thing with the mobiles is that what has been, what my area of focus has been the whole idea of trying to get students to design mobile apps to address different kind of challenges that they face. Now, there are so many ways in which I've just recently done an article on citizen developers, where the whole argument is that the best people to design mobile apps for education are educators, people who are well placed to design apps for in whatever industry, are those that are in it. And what we actually begin to see is that we are able to empower different citizens to become app developers without using code. They don't have to have coding or programming skills to actually do that. There are ways in which we can empower and bring about and grow creativity through that. Now, it becomes very difficult for one to fail to assess that, because you are actually creating artifacts. And whenever you create artifacts, you've got something that you can be able to look at, to evaluate, as opposed to the as opposed to otherwise. So most of the kind of uses of the mobile has been to ensure that you are creating artifacts, or students can create artifacts and share the artifacts using the mobile. So either way, there are artifacts which are persistent as an outcome of the engagement, or using the tool like the mobile as a medium to share what has been created, and also to reflect on what has been created and sharing that with other people. And that is what the power of the mobile and the affordances of the mobile, and in my view, maybe the best way to use the mobile technologies which are in the hands of students.
I think that's wonderful. I think that takes sort of our interaction with technology, or the use of technology, to a whole nother level, where the students are also engaging in that creative technological process as well. And I think that's quite valuable. And I'm wondering, Dick, just coming back to you on sort of a similar point, when it comes to the literature, or the academic writing, or the sort of writing within the educational field, how much are we seeing sort of conversations about these creative approaches being reflected in the literature? And in addition to that, do we see sort of different types of literatures that are coming out of different country contexts, right? In other words, should we be thinking about developing a body of literature, a body of scholarship that is, focused on given sort of social, economic context, or are there sort of more broader themes that should be explored?
Well, I think we need to be able to grow in that kind of area. There are most of the traditional publishing mediums, they may not always appreciate that kind of levels of creativity, creative designs like that, in which case we must be able to be thinking about how do we ensure that we can grow in finding effective ways of disseminating creative works, particularly the creative works that are emerging as a result of the use of emerging technologies. Because there is lots of potential and there is lots of things that are happening ground up in terms of creativity, and we need to be able to harness that and find the best way of ensuring that we can begin to package and sharing that with audiences who can be able to learn from that. Because you'd be amazed at the kind of things that in the last couple of years, in the last 3-4 years, using the digital sandpits, I've been surprised to see that over 1,500 teachers and in-service teachers, both in-service and pre-service teachers, have created digital artifacts in the form of e-portfolios, which actually has been amazing, because most of these teachers are those that never thought that they could even create a digital artifact. And we actually begin to see that they've created digital artifacts to that effect. And we need to be able to find better ways of ensuring that we can make the most of the creative abilities and creative potential that educators have, and also finding better ways of ensuring that we can disseminate this to the appropriate audiences, so that we can be able to multiply the creativity, as it were.
And I want to just build off of that. I want to get to you, Karen, because I see you nodding quite a lot, so I'm coming to you in a minute. But one of the things, Dick, you made me think about was sort of the capacity that universities have to help support some of these initiatives. And when professors decide to, say, include a component of their course that is going to create these digital artifacts, and the tools that are perhaps needed at an institutional level to help individual professors carry that out. And so I'm curious to you, Apona, since you've looked quite a lot at sort of, support for ICT and sort of this nexus between higher education and ICT, where are some of the strengths when we look at African educational institution in this respect, and where are some of the areas in which there may be important opportunities to bridge some of the gaps that may be present between the demands that professors may have to do some of these creative sort of assignments and the actual resources that are available?
Peter, as we said in one of the previous sessions, it's such a wide spectrum of higher education institutions we have in South Africa. The infrastructure present at each institution is so vastly different. So there isn't a clear-cut answer that we can say, well, you need to put in this type of infrastructure, that type of support for students. It depends on the type of institution that you're working with. It also depends on who your students are. So certain institutions have, a large majority of students who come from the lower quintile schools. And so different institutions will need to implement different strategies in order to support their students and to support their staff. But I think one thing that's very clear is Prof. Ngambi spoke about, getting students to develop artifacts, and Prof. Karen spoke about how her students, she was surprised by the way in which they use technology and how creative and innovative they were. And I think if you give your students the opportunity to express themselves and to do the investigation on their own about the different types of technology that they can use, you will be amazed by what your students can achieve. Many of our students are very techno-savvy. They're able to use mobile phones for socialization purposes. And now that we're expecting them to use the mobile phone or any form of technology for educational purposes, they have a new challenge awaiting them. And for those students who are really interested, they are able to understand the different platforms that are available. They're able to experiment with them. And I found myself with my third year students last semester, when we gave them a similar project to what Prof. Karen gave, is that I learned so much from them about the tools which I'm currently using. So I learned different features, for example, in Zoom, while the students were doing their own presentations. And I think we need to foster this in the students, because irrespective of whether they're studying linguistics, economics, biology, whatever it might be, those basic digital skills are absolutely essential going forward post-COVID. And obviously the IT students would be different. They would need to know how to use different forms of technology. But if we can encourage our students with the infrastructure that we have in our institutions, what's available to us, what's available freely on the internet. You spoke about the literature and about research. Attending these types of conferences, these types of seminars, reading research papers, we get to learn about so many new tools and ways in which tools are being used innovatively by educators, that we can experiment with them even in our own classroom without having to invest in a lot of money. Funds are probably the biggest issue with anybody trying to experiment with technology.
Karen, I saw you nodding earlier. You want to sort of add to this, some of these suggestions that have been made?
Yeah, I mean, I can't stop nodding because, I mean, everything what my colleagues are saying, makes sense. And I think we really need to push forward in that direction. I liked very much what Upasana was saying about this type of work or interaction giving us as lecturers an opportunity to learn from our students. And I think that's what the pandemic and what the trends were already going in that direction, but the pandemic has accelerated that. Of course, we're not complete equals. Of course, we have certain skills and competencies, which is why we are employed as lecturers. But we seem to forget that our students come with all that experience and all those competencies, skills, knowledge, attitude that we can also benefit from. And I think that's something that I've really appreciated, and that I think the technologies will assist us in accepting even more, that we are partners in the learning and in the teaching and learning process.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. And I even think about this at the more extreme level. There are some professors that would argue that their students know a lot more about the technology than they do, right? And I think we experience some of that in our transitions and our institutional transitions from in person to online, or using some of these platforms. We saw that, and the professor would say, my students know a lot more about Zoom and where all the buttons are and what to do than I do. And so I'm interested in thinking about that point a little bit more, because I see that Juliana and some others have mentioned this point about the training that professors will have to have or receive, or the knowledge that they'll need to sort of explore some of these different assignments and approaches. And I'm curious, Nick, what do you sort of see as some of the barriers or potential opportunities when it comes to ensuring professors are able to mobilize some of these assignments and some of these technologies in the ways that you've mentioned?
Well, I think sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
The first thing really is to understand that you, as an academic staff, you need to want to empower students to do things. I think that's the first part, because students would go quite a long way if they feel that they've been empowered to actually do that. And students also do seize opportunities to want to teach back to their fellow students, and also to teach the academic staff if there is openness to want to do that. Mm-hmm. And so the first thing that becomes quite important is to get the academic staff to learn to experiment, because they need to experiment first. They need to carry out, they should try out some of these different tools and technologies, not in the presence of students, but they must be able to ensure that they try these out, they gain the confidence, and they empower students to actually run with it. And that is one of the ways in which academic staff are able to feel that they can be able to leverage the skills that students bring with to the learning space. I know of students who have always used the mobile phone, but they've never used a desktop at all. And then the first time they use a desktop is when they go to the university. And now you can just imagine that they've used mobile phones, they've never used the desktop, and then they use the desktop for the first time at the university, and they really feel like fish out of water. But one would think that if you meet those students halfway, you design activities in a way that they can use their mobile phones, they can actually make the most of the skills and their competencies that they bring with, you'll be surprised at how much you can be able to reduce the zone of proximal development, as we call it, because you are able to meet the students halfway. And that is one of the things that becomes quite useful. And also academic staff through the professional learning communities, they are able to learn from other academics. But of course, there must be openness to want to do that. If academic staff are not willing to learn from other academic staff, then there's not going to be any way forward. So one of the things I've actually seen is that being able to encourage academic staff to attend seminars and workshops where these things are presented by fellow academic staff on their own experiences, on what they're experiencing and how they're learning with the students, is able to give confidence to the academic staff to want to do something. Remember, the whole thing is that it's about learning design, and you don't always need to be able to do that if you don't have the skills as an academic staff. You can empower students to actually do that. So that's one way of doing that. My other comment is about the institutional infrastructure and how that there are always limitations with institutional infrastructure. And you actually see that the capacity for most institutions to support the academic staff is never enough at all for the number of academic staff at institutions and the like. But for most of what one needs to actually do is to look at the free tools, free software, free apps that do not necessarily need the institutional infrastructure to get them set up and to get them to work. And you'll be able to see that when academic staff starts looking to these kind of tools, it actually opens up lots of possibilities there. And so that's one of the kind of ways in which academic staff are able to begin to look at how best they can move forward in terms of meeting the students halfway.
Yeah, now we'll reflect on some of those tools or open source opportunities as we continue here and talk about some of those platforms. I know, Apona, you mentioned one in terms of Moodle, right? An LMS, a whole full-scale learning platform that also has an app and the ability to be used and optimized as such. But we'll get to that in a moment. But I want to reflect on something you mentioned, Dick, in this issue of an emphasis on experimentation. And I know that some professors have different levels of tolerance for experimentation, right? Some will embrace it, right? Like they'll go to a workshop, right? One of your workshops, for example, for creating some of the many artifacts that you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation. And they're going to sort of dive right in and they're going to try to implement it. But I can imagine other professors saying, I'd like to experiment, but I'm a little uncertain for a lot of different reasons, right? We can think about more junior faculty, right? When they're thinking about teaching, they're teaching evaluations or things like that. They're like, well, let me play it safe a little bit here, right? Or others say, well, if I add this added element, it's going to distract me from what I'm really good at doing or the ways I've always done it, right? There are a lot of different reasons why people may not experiment. But how do we, in your mind, Dick, get beyond some of these problems, some of which I've argued or I've mentioned are more structural in the nature of academia, and others are sort of more of mindset changing. So how do we begin to sort of change that on a broad and more systematic level, and also for individuals?
Well, I think most of that is going to be my mindset change, because it is quite obvious that if one looks at children and the way they learn how different kinds of tools and devices work, They hardly read a manual. You buy a new phone or whatever device that you bring in the house and you give it to a child, and before long, they would have figured out how it works, and they can actually begin showing you how it works. And you see the kind of level and the speed at which these young people or children experiment with the different kind of devices. And that is very similar to what is expected of adults and educators to do. Because one of the things that happens that there is no way you are going to go beyond your comfort zone in terms of what you know if you cannot be able to want to experiment. And experimentation and the tolerance for experimentation, which of course one will be able to say, well, some academic staff don't have the tolerance for experimentation. I mean, I would wonder really, what kind of tolerance, what other kind of levels of tolerance would they be if one hasn't got the tolerance for experimentation? Because learning is all a process of experimentation. Because, you cannot be able to learn if you don't try and fail and things like that. Learning is all a process of that. It's about having confidence to know that to learn, you've got to experiment. You've got to try things out. You've got to, and what you're actually saying by implication is that some educators then haven't actually learned how to learn, or they need to learn how to learn. And to actually do that, unfortunately, there's no alternative to experimentation, particularly when we're dealing with emerging technologies, which are in a continuous state of emerging. And if one can't experiment, then it's very easy to just lag behind. And so many things can just go past them. And that's one of the things that I could be able to say. It's just about ensuring that the mindset change is what we begin to focus on. We've actually developed a student of mine and I developed a model on how to place these different educators in terms of their mindsets and the awareness of technology and how they teach, the relationship between how they teach and the awareness of the technology. And we actually begin to see that it is actually possible that some educators, the way they teach and the awareness of technology, there seems to be a correlation there. They may not be aware of technology as much, and therefore they teach the way they teach. And other teachers, they are very much aware of the different possibilities, and you could actually see that begins to shift how they teach. So there is a relationship between being aware of how something works and the possibilities of some tool or such like, and being able to make the use of it. Because you are not going to teach with something that you've never heard about, something you know not about, something that you have absolutely no confidence in using. So the first thing that educators need to do is to build confidence in a tool, a confidence in how something can be able to function. And they don't have to know everything. You just need to know enough to teach, as I've heard already, where if one is talking about Zoom, know enough about Zoom and then run with that. And then grow in the understanding of that, draw students in and learn from that. So that is the best way to be able to approach this.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. And before we sort of move on in our conversation, I do want to acknowledge a couple of the comments in the chat. Jared has mentioned, for example, that has really embraced this concept that's coming out of our conversations, where professors are not sort of seen as this top-down figure, right, but rather collaborating with students in new ways, right? And this emphasis in the context of collaboration on empowerment and broader empowerment, right? And I think that seemed to be a theme that is resonating quite a lot with our audience. It certainly has resonated with me as well. Now, Apona, now thinking about what Dick has just mentioned and sort of thinking about frameworks of looking at staff and faculty in terms of their mindsets and in terms of the potential opportunities for changing mindsets or reinforcing mindsets that are there. How can research help us begin to get at some of those questions? Because I know that you've been working in some of your research with institutions and faculty members, really understanding some of their challenges, some of their mindsets. So how can research help us sort of understand the baseline of what we're dealing with, so that we can think through some of these support structures for experimentation?
Thanks, Peter. I think perhaps self-evaluation by academics as to how, I wouldn't say digitally literate, but how confident they are in using technology for teaching purposes is probably the starting point. If we had to do an evaluation, a self-evaluation a year ago, many of the academics who were traditional face-to-face lecturers would tell you that they were fairly incompetent. Mm-hmm. They were forced to learn during this period. And I think many of us, between the first semester and second semester last year, learned a lot about ourselves and about how we can deliver in the online mode. And then having this short break which we had during the December vacation probably gave us enough time to assimilate our experiences that we had, and then try to, improve on our delivery methods and our assessment methods for the next year. So perhaps a self-evaluation is probably going to be, a good starting point to understand yourself and where you are in terms of the technology spectrum of being able to use technology to deliver online teaching and assessment. I also think that it's very important for us to develop this concept of sharing with each other, whether it's sharing in your own discipline, sharing with colleagues across disciplines. But we're all in this journey together, and we're all forced into this journey of moving into the online space. So if you know a tool has worked well, or if you know something didn't work well in your prescribed learning management system, for example, just sharing it with colleagues helps to build confidence. As Prof. Ngambi spoke about, it's about having confidence in the tool. And you're never going to have full confidence the first time you use the tool. But if you engage your students in that learning process, so often I ask my students to help me when we're experimenting with a new tool. So I would say, for example, to the class rep to let me know if everything's okay on the other side, because I can't see what my students can see. So I might think I'm sharing my screen, for example, and I'm not sharing it, and the students might be too scared to tell me that they can't see my shared screen. So it's about building up this confidence, and the only way you can do it is not to try to take the journey alone, but to take it along with your colleagues. Get your students involved as well, because your students will then also see that they are part of this entire process as well. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure if that really answered your question, but
I was going to say, go ahead.
Yeah, so like we spoke about, the framework that he's tested, and I would very much like to read up on that framework, because the framework which I looked at, or I put together during the first or the early stages of the COVID pandemic, looked at ways in which academics can skill themselves for this transition to online environment, especially those with the generation gap, for example, that we've spoken about, or those who are not as confident about the online space.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. No, I think that does answer the question, and I think it emphasizes the fact that in this process of experimentation that we're engaging with, that the students are a part of that, right? And you're sort of transparent, perhaps, in the context of that, right? And that allows them to be comfortable to share the necessary feedback that you have to either, stop an experiment if it's not working, or to tinker with that experiment within semesters or between semesters. So I think that consistent sort of feedback loop is quite important. And I'm glad you've mentioned that, Apona. And now I want to turn, so we've been talking about mindsets. We've been talking about sort of faculty, how they embrace some of these technologies. And one of the things that's coming up here which I think is really important, is that we've stopped sort of talking about the use of technology in the pandemic period, right? We've done a little bit of that, but I think we're looking not necessarily past the pandemic, because it's unclear when the pandemic will ever end, or whether there will be another sort of disruption in higher education and in learning. But we are sort of looking past this period in terms of the staying power of the uses of some of these technologies. And so I want to start with you, Karen. What are some of the sort of the tools or experiments that you think are that we've sort of perhaps taken a look at or emphasized perhaps more during this pandemic period that have a little bit more staying power, or you expect to have some staying power as we sort of not necessarily exit this period, but at least perhaps have some modification to the present dispensation?
Well, for me, I think many of the things that are the mobile technologies will probably stay with us and get refined and improved and better suited to our diverse needs, because they're really diverse. I mean, if you look to Northern America or to China or to Europe, and then you look to Africa, we have different needs, and we should be tailor making applications and mobile technologies, to those needs. So I think those will definitely grow. I suppose we need to look at virtual realities. We need to look at gamification. I am not sure whether environments such as Zoom or Skype or Teams or Adobe Connect, I don't know if I think there will be improved versions of that very soon. I think there are many things that we are too uncomfortable with. There are also issues of privacy. Today I'm sitting in my lounge. I'm happy to share my lounge with you. Some people might not be happy to do so. So I think those are all kinds of things that we need to think about, and that will have an impact on the technologies that we will use in the near future and in the longer future.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. And how about for you, Dick? What do you think is going to be sort of some of these approaches or technologies that are going to have a little bit more staying power than perhaps others that you've seen experimented with during this period and before?
I think most of the kind of technologies that are likely to have the staying power are those that fit in with the different social cultural settings that people find themselves in. And I think that's one of the things about being able to understand the different settings which Karen is talking about, that our needs are different. I think if one looks at in Africa, the social cultural apps that foster community engagement and apps that get closer to natural ways of engagement, normally and ideally are likely to have more kind of staying power. If you think about the reason why WhatsApp has been relatively successful in Africa, for instance, is because it sits in very well with the kind of communal social settings that most communities have already been used. In other words, that's the way people live. So you can create all these different kinds of groups and family groups, your extended family, closer family, and so on, and you can engage with them at different kinds of levels, and you can have other groups, professional groups, and so on. And that the fact that one can be able to say, look, I don't have time to actually type the text, or I don't have the literacy to actually type in the text, I can just be able to send a voice note on WhatsApp that easy with which the communication is enabled, it just allows many different kinds of people to be able to engage on the app. And the other fact that one can just be able to look at the integration with the camera and the video and things like that, and the easy with which one can just be able to share that. That's one of the things that is going to, most of the kind of apps that are going to foster very natural ways of engagement, natural ways of understanding, or natural ways of interaction are most likely to be successful. And those are the ones that are being drawn much closer in education, and the ones that would find themselves, the technology that finds it easy to be hidden away so that it becomes invisible and while making visible the activity, making visible what needs to happen. Those are the kind of apps that are going to find themselves very successful. In other words, the technology which does not sit and stand in the way of engagement. Because if, for example, if one is organizing an event, you want to focus on organizing the event. You don't want to focus on the technology. You want to use the technology to organize the event so that you can focus on the event as opposed to focusing on the technology. That's what I mean by making the technology invisible. So most of those kind of apps that will flow naturally in a natural setting of the people, that is going to be most successful. If one looks at the whole concept of a desktop, which assumes that one has got a desk and one is in the office or such like, is not typically what represents a number of people in this part of the world. What you actually see is that a number of people work in spaces where the desk is not what you need. And it's actually those apps that speak to the natural settings and easy to actually work them. And that there's almost nothing that you need to change much in trying to make that work. And that the technology is not standing in the way. You can just be able, if your mode of communication is whatever mode of communication, if somebody can be able, they don't have to learn a new language to actually use the app. And for those apps that are like that and that foster like that are going to be successful. The other kind of apps is the ones that could enable offline engagements, offline interactions. Offline, in other words, when you're offline, you can build stuff and engage and do whatever you need to do. And when you have an opportunity to connect, then all that is synced. Those kind of apps are going to become, or those kind of technologies are going to become quite useful, because that is where the success story is going to lie. And also the ones that reduce the transactional distance, the ones that allow people who need help to reach those that can help them, and reduce that transactional gap. Those apps are the ones that are going to be very successful. So think of any setting. People that are, the patients need to reach health practitioners and doctors, and the quicker they can do that, that is going to be very successful. The students need to have access to content, need to have access to teachers, they need to have access to mentors. The quicker they do that, that is going to be quite useful. So you can actually begin to see that transactional distance and reducing that is going to be critical. The natural settings of people and ensuring that you can actually, as close as possible, work the way they work, speak the way they, in other words, engage in the way they are socialized. That is going to be quite useful, as opposed to allowing a situation whereby the technology begins to completely change the way people live. The successful technologies are going to actually be easy to integrate in the way people live and support them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love also that mention of offline, online, right? And some of the comments in the chat and the common theme you often hear throughout our series was this issue of connectivity issues, right? And being able to have a technology that can sort of store information offline and then upload it later, or to just store or do activities offline, as well as have that sort of communication component, is really useful to dealing with that. So I see Jan had a question regarding that. So hopefully that provided you some insights on that point. But I think the larger point, Dick, that you make about making technology sort of accord more naturally with what we are trying to do, and not making the technology be the focus of what people are paying attention to. And I know that's one of the complaints that many professors have, is that the technology takes over, right? That entire exercise. And they're focused on the technology as opposed to the content and what they're trying to do and their pattern of teaching. But technologies that are able to be very natural, as you described in that context, will lower some of those barriers and also make things more accessible and more used quite readily by students as well. So I think that point is really well taken. Now, coming to you, Karen, and we're coming up against the end of our program. So I want to encourage those of you who are in the audience to make sure to share your questions and comments in the chat, because I will be sharing them live, or raise your hand and we can actually share the mic with you if you feel comfortable speaking and sharing your sort of views. Feel free to use the raised hand button on the bottom. But coming to you, Karen, we've talked about a lot of different platforms, and you mentioned a number of them. Adobe Connect, a lot of these different conferencing softwares there. What are some of the platforms that are out there that people are not perhaps using, but should be using or should be considering, particularly those platforms that perhaps, if you haven't been following the sort of digital education space, the edutech space, that you may have been missing out on, that perhaps meet some of the criteria that we've just been mentioning about the ease of use, the intuitive nature of those technologies. So what are some recommendations, Karen, and how do you sort of gauge those recommendations?
Right. One I learned about, at the beginning of the pandemic, we all went to Zoom, I think. And then, very soon afterwards, we started looking for things that were open source, so that we could reduce costs. And, for example, Big Blue Button for me was a very welcome newbie on the field, So I've kind of enjoyed seeing what is possible on Big Blue Button. It's very similar to Zoom, but it's open source, so we can collaboratively improve it, work on it, get a better version of it, one that is better suited to our needs. So I think that's what I like very much. Otherwise, what has also impressed me is all the things like Bandicam. So instead of using Google Slides, Bandicam is something nice, which if you make a little video of 10 minutes maximum, it's free. We can use it for free. So I really would like to encourage people to look for freely available applications, software, technologies. There are many available, and I think that's the direction we should all be going in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned earlier in the conversation, and it's come up here, the sort of importance of open source technologies, technologies that are open and easily optimized, that are free and accessible. And if you get really excited about a certain open source technology, you can actually join and contribute to the development of that platform as well. And some of these communities are open to that type of collaboration and development. They're always looking for collaborators oftentimes. So wonderful. So Big Blue Button, for those of you who don't know, it's a conferencing software that, again, is more attuned to sort of conferencing in an educational sort of space, right? And so one of the things we think about in terms of what we've been talking about, which is Zoom wasn't designed for a teaching platform at the beginning, right? It was Zoom meeting, to meet with people, to collaborate, to have conversations, right? But we also see these other conferencing platforms that can be used. Jared said Twitter is is another platform we could use that is accessible. And I have seen some assignments that have involved social media or social interaction with professors. I've tried it a couple of semesters myself. It's been some years since I've done some Twitter assignments, but Twitter may be a different platform. So feel free in the audience to share your recommendations in the chat as well. But Dick, how about for you? What are some platforms that are out there that you would recommend, and perhaps some of those that are lesser known or perhaps even just beginning or starting out?
Well, at the moment, I'm very much focused on really trying to get the pre-service teachers ready to actually go out there and use technology when they leave when they graduate. And therefore, there's less emphasis on the use of learning management system, because the learning management system does not always align with what is being supported, what is available at the different schools when they get there. So the whole idea really has been the focus on the cloud-based tools, and most of the kind of tools that and apps that are available, the Google apps, are some of the kind of things that we have been focusing on in really trying to get students to use and to understand how to work those different kind of tools. And then the other tools have been things like the flip grid has been quite popular in terms of the fostering the conversations, because what one really wants to do is that even now particularly during the pandemic, when students were all distributed, the use of Flipgrid allowed students to feel that they are together, feel that they have got a certain kind of voice and sense of creating artifacts that persist. And that was quite interesting there. So we're just looking at things like the Google Translate. I don't know if for those that have experimented with that, where you can be able to use your phone to just point at any one of the symbols, and you could choose a language and it would convert that. For example, if you look at the road sign like stop, and you use your camera, your phone, and you point at the word stop, it would then translate that to Xhosa or Zulu or whatever language. And that becomes quite useful if one is trying to really understand the interpretations of some of these different symbols, particularly if you go in a different place and you want to be able to understand how these different things interpreted, a very quick way of interpreting them. And so Google Translate as an app that has been quite handy. Encourage students to actually look at Google Keep has also been quite useful, just like the Jamboard. So we looked at those different kind of apps, Google apps in particular. And on the so in terms of the experimentations, that has been quite one of the ways in which we actually looking at the different apps to support the use of cloud-based tools, so that one can be able to hit the road running once they get there, and they can be able to go and experiment with the different tools themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can personally also vouch for Flipgrid that you mentioned. It is a platform that anyone can access. I believe it is still free to access without even an institutional email, so it can be easily used. And it allows students, so for those of you who don't know, to record short video responses up to 10 minutes. So you can actually restrict them. You could say, give me a 30-second response or a minute response up to 10 minutes. And then you give them a prompt and they respond, and then they can put videos to each other, and it works on a phone really well, works on a computer as well, very well. And I've actually found it's very good because it primes students in the social science to be prepared to express themselves well in class, because you want those discussions. If I already know what they're sort of saying, or they've already vocalized something, then it becomes really useful in that way. And as you mentioned, Dick, it also builds community because they're seeing each other, they're hearing from each other, and they're having that connection as well. So I can personally vouch for that experiment that I began at the beginning of August when our semester in the U.S. had begun. And then you mentioned Google Apps as well. Yeah, go ahead, Karen. Go ahead.
No, I wanted to say, and Padlet as well is very useful, I think.
Padlet. And do you want to tell us a little bit about it? Just a little bit?
Well, I think Padlet is very similar to Jamboard. It allows you to create artifacts, to share them, to comment, to collaboratively work towards a project. It can be a visual, it can be audio, it can be visio. It allows many different things, and it's also something that can be used on a smartphone. So we don't have to go desktop or laptop or whatever, but just on our mobile devices.
Wonderful. Good. One of the questions that I have, and we're coming to the end of our conversation here, one of the questions I have about these new apps that are either, becoming more ubiquitous or coming up is how much are us as faculty members engaging in sort of conversations with those who are building these technologies, right? Because one of the criteria we've had for thinking about adoption of technologies is that it sort of fits into our practice and it fits into sort of students' lives in the given context in which it's going to be used. But are we as professors perhaps having conversations or finding ways to sort of advocate for ourselves or perhaps even build specialized tools that will work in that way? What is our role in this sort of creative process? And I'll start with you, Dick. What do you think our role is as professors, both in your space, which is more sort of directly having these conversations, but perhaps outside of that immediate sort of edutech space?
Look, I think that that's a tricky question because our role is to design things that match and fit in the kind of context in which we want to be able to use, and where we can, we are able to customize things. I mean, some few years ago, some years ago now, I did some work on empowering marginalized voices, so that the marginalized voices could actually get a voice from the dominant voices that suppressed them. And so I had to develop a tool, which was an anonymous knowledge sharing tool, where the communication was anonymous. And what eventually had to happen with that tool was that it was designed and integrated after experimentation and testing the tool, researching the tool. It was eventually integrated in the learning management system. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the best way we can be able to do that. If we can either build tools or customize tools that we want to use the way we actually see the challenges ourselves. And that's the only way we can be able to make a contribution and input on the kind of tools that are going to be developed and designed. But look, I don't. If the tech developers consult different kind of industries, they will be able to receive different kinds of feedbacks from that. But I think being able to ensure that one designs for the appropriate audience, particularly for given the things that we've already talked about, will be quite critical.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Karen, what do you see as sort of our role in the developments and the sort of conversations about ensuring that our technology that we're using is optimized for the purposes that we would like?
I think our main role as faculty, as lecturers, as professors, is to ensure that we know who are the tech-savvy people amongst us so that we can identify the issues and communicate them to the developers. As we said before, not all of us have the capacities, have the wish or the intention to go and directly develop apps or technologies. But we need to be able to translate the need and to communicate to the developer exactly what we want. And I think that's where our responsibility lies, because we can see the needs, we can feel them, personally when we are teaching, but we can also get them from our students. What works for them, what doesn't work, what would they like to see in addition to what already exists.
Wonderful. Good. All right. So I'm trying to check to see if there are any other questions or comments that are in the chat. We have a couple of questions that we can deal with as we wrap up. The first one is, how do we lobby governments in African countries to make learning technology more freely available to citizens? Perhaps some of the supports that students would need to use technologies like bandwidth, things of this nature. Do you have any thoughts on what we should be doing to sort of lobby in this respect for more resources, as we've talked about resource constraint always being an underlying issue that's in any institution?
I think we need to work more with the ministries and the governments, and at national level. I think being able to ensure that we can engage them is one way of ensuring that we can lobby them. I think that most of the government departments would be interested in understanding how universities can work with them. And I think being able to find ways of reaching out to them and collaborate so that one can be able to collaborate with them would be the best way forward, I think. And I think places where there has been initiatives where the local governments and the national governments have been drawn in, those kind of collaborations seem to have yielded some positive outcomes. So we can be able to lobby more.
Wonderful. Good. And any other thoughts from you, Karen, on that question? Or should we be engaging in sort of more lobby efforts or relationships with relevant ministries to help sort of?
I think definitely. I mean, often, there's some kind of friction between institutions of higher learning and ministries. We don't always collaborate nicely, and I think that's something that needs to change. I think also what the pandemic has brought to the fore is all these issues of equity, of social justice, of access, to the internet, to devices, the digital divide. So I think also not only as faculty, as staff members, but just as citizens, I think as citizens, as communities, we need to voice our demands more clearly, because obviously we can't do it without government. We do need to work hand in hand. And I think that's when we will be able to achieve better things for our future.
Okay, wonderful. So we're up against time, so I'll give you guys both a little bit of a moment to just sort of share your final reflections and leave our audience with perhaps some words of wisdom as we, again, brave this continuing pandemic environment, but also thinking beyond that as we have in this session to sort of encouraging many of the faculty members who are present, because I'm noticing we do have a number of faculty members who are here. What are some steps that they could take in the next few days, weeks, and months ahead to sort of think about experimenting in their own practice? I'll start with you, Karen.
Right. Okay. I think while we're in the pandemic, we need to manage our stress levels. So we need to ensure that we are comfortable. So experimenting, yes, as much as possible, but and pushing ourselves out of our comfort zones, but let's not exaggerate. We need to think long term. So if we are going to focus all our energy on the here and now, we might burn out. So I can see lots of my colleagues getting tired, getting fed up. So let's take, baby steps, keep going, keep looking around, keep checking for new developments that can serve us better. I think that's what I would like to say.
Okay, wonderful. Excellent. And how about you, Dick? What would you say?
Well, first and foremost, technologies are here to stay, and they will continue to emerge. It's quite important for academic staff to realize that it's quite important to experiment, to try things out, and that we have a very important role as academic staff because we serve as models. So we do model what we do and how we do it to our students. And I think the more students learn that we also learn and that we are open to learning, the more they are also going to be that. So it becomes quite useful that students also begin to feel that they can teach academic staff something. So by allowing them to drawing them in and meeting them halfway and allowing them to bring the skills, particularly ensuring that we don't disadvantage them by wanting them not to exploit the skills that they bring with, because they do bring some skills to the higher education. And we want to be able to make the most of what they bring as well, in as much as we teach them new stuff. There is no way that it doesn't matter how much students may know about tech. We have a lot to teach these students in terms of the specializations, the knowledge, the skills the specializations for which they need to qualify. And therefore being able to ensure that the students can actually begin to engage and using the skills that they are comfortable in will be quite useful. So academic staff should definitely be able to experiment more. And they don't have to know everything, but they just need to ensure that they know enough. And you don't have to know everything, just know something. And build on that something and use that something as opposed to wanting to know everything.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So you should feel encouraged at the end of this session to experiment, to empower yourself as a professor or a lecturer, and to also know that in doing that, you're also empowering the students, which is why we bring this passion to our practice as well. And again, I want to also thank the audience as well. They're mentioning that these ideas should be put forward more directly to government and other key stakeholders, and we can also agree. So we certainly are recording the proceedings, so you're welcome to share the recording of today's session when it comes out in a couple of days. But I do want to thank everyone for joining us here on Leaders of Africa Live. And we will invite you to engage with us again in the future and also immediately after this session. We are using a new technology. We are experimenting with a platform called AirMeet, which allows you to, after this session, jump into small discussion tables and discuss some of these topics amongst yourself in the audience. So we really encourage you to stay on the platform afterwards to have those conversations after we close. And if you are watching after the fact, we encourage you to hit the subscribe button on YouTube channel to subscribe to all of the new content from the Leaders of Africa and the Leaders of Africa Institute, and also engage in the conversation on Discord, our chat community platform that we use for conversations like these in real time. So we encourage you to join us there, and also on all of the social media channels that Leaders of Africa in the Institute are present. We also lastly invite you to stay tuned for our next series. Moving on, we're moving in a slightly different direction and looking at a continental-wide free trade agreement that was recently put into practice in recent months and has been debated or discussed for many years. So we'll be turning to look at the Africa Continental Free Trade Area and the agreement associated with it over the next month. So join us next Thursday for the beginning of those conversations, including with members of the Secretariat of the AFCTA as well as key stakeholders. So we hope to see you next Thursday. So that's all from me, Peter Panar. Thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you again and see you in the digital tables and breakout rooms afterwards if you'd like. So take care and bye-bye.